Hello, people. I have finished a book, Philip and Alexander, Kings and Conquerors. This is at least the fourth book I've had regarding Alexander. It was a pretty good book. This book came from when I was back in Michigan in October. My son bought me this book and the book that I'm probably going to read next. One of them was for Father's Day and one was for my birthday, which was in October. It took me a couple weeks to read this book. There is 509 pages, and this was published in 2020. I guess I'm going to start including the author's name in these little videos, because I really don't do that. This guy's name is Adrian Goldsworthy. It was a decent book. There was some stuff in here that I had never read before about Alexander. And he also, doesn't spend a whole lot of time on the Gordian knot. The Gordian knot is like one paragraph in the book. So things that other authors have made a great big deal out of, this guy kind of breezes right by. Okay, so I got to go to page 114, and this little quote doesn't really have much to do with Alexander. I just thought it was kind of topical for the ridiculous mess that the politics in this country is. I gotta find this because it's not an entire paragraph. Genuine conviction and a convenient opportunity were not, and are not, mutually exclusive in politics, and the repetition of a message can convince the speaker as much as the audience. I thought that was, kind of like all the lying that goes on in politics today, and on Facebook and YouTube. They were talking about this guy, Demosthenes, and I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but they talk about him, at least, the first half of the book is mostly about Philip, who, of course, was Alexander's father. But this Demosthenes guy really hated Philip, and most of his speeches, he was an Athenian orator. Most of his speeches were condemnations of Philip. My next note here is good info on Philip. Philip was a very interesting character. He started out with nothing, unlike, Alexander inherited a very strong Macedonia, and Philip kind of built it up from scratch. Macedonia wasn't shit before Philip. Philip is dead by page 197, and Philip is assassinated by one of his bodyguards, who happens to be a former lover of Philip. When Philip is away, this former lover is treated brutally by some other members of the court. He's gang raped, and then Philip does really nothing to punish these guys. So when Philip comes back, this guy says, "I'm going to make him pay for that," and he kills Philip. Almost gets away, almost gets to his horse before he's killed by some of the other bodyguards. This author is kind of odd in that the author questions all of Alexander's supposedly homosexual relationships with various people, but he has no problem accepting it when it comes to Philip. Throughout the book, sources are cited. Plutarch, Arrian. I have Arrian's book, The Campaigns of Alexander. It was a pretty good book. So far I haven't read anything written by Plutarch, but I know of Plutarch, He's a pretty interesting character. Eventually I'll get to that. Not all the authors from antiquity are great. I got a book by Livy up at my cabin that I've been trying to read for years, and I think I'm still only about halfway through with that. I don't have much to read in here, but there's a little bit. Bottom of 256, top of 257. Alexander paused at Ephesus for several weeks. I just look at these paragraphs and say, how many fucking words am I not going to be able to pronounce here? Making offerings to Artemis and holding a formal parade of celebration, while detachments went out to accept the surrender of other cities. During this time, he sat for a portrait by the famous Greek painter Apelles. The brash young king was friendly, but inclined to voice strong opinions about artistic technique, in spite of his scant knowledge. Eventually, the artist quietly suggested that Alexander had better stop, because even his junior assistants were laughing at his ignorance. An early version of the portrait with the king astride Bucephalus did not receive royal approval, and Bucephalus, if I'm pronouncing that right, was his horse. Of course, most people know that. He was very fond of this horse. Did not receive royal approval, but when modified to show him wielding a thunderbolt like Zeus, the king was delighted, prompting him to give no less than 20 talents to the painter, and announced that from now on only Apelles was allowed to paint his official portrait. And then underneath that I have, what became of this? I don't know that there's really any likenesses of Alexander. I mean, I know there's statues and shit, but I think a lot of those were done after he was dead. There may be some coinage. That's usually all there is some coinage. The Gordian knot rates one paragraph, and there's a reason for that. This author really goes into great detail about sources and about whether he thinks something was actually happened or was invented later on. And this guy thinks that the whole Gordian knot episode was just later on invented, because nothing, before Alexander, you can't find anything written about the Gordian knot anywhere. So it was theater, that's all it was. Third paragraph, page 340. Respect for the locals only went so far, and there were celebrations of victory marked by sacrifices and athletic competition. Statues of Harmodius and Aristogiton, Athenian heroes who had assassinated a tyrant, had been part of the plunder brought home by Xerxes, and were now sent back to Athens, and remained on view in Arrian's day. There was a royal throne and footstool in the palace at Susa, designed for the tall Darius, and when Alexander climbed into the chair, his feet did not reach the footstool. So someone pushed the higher royal dining table over instead. A eunuch, himself part of the spoils of conquest, wept at the sight. And Alexander was supposed to have been about to order it taken away when Philotas assured him that it was a good omen. This Philotas guy was the one that traveled with him, reading the bones and reading the entrails and saying whether a bird flying over was a good or a bad omen. And he really just said, it was a good omen if he thought it would please Alexander. That's all that was. But in another book, a previous book that I read about Alexander, I read that there was a guy who was tasked with going to these throne rooms and making sure that the footstool would reach Alexander's feet, because Alexander did not like that. He was, sort of a short man. He was probably about my height. Alexander dies on page 487, which is almost the very end of the book. So they really don't go into much the divvying up and the infighting in his empire that he had established. They go into it a little bit. We all know the Ptolemies had a pretty long career, but that's that's almost the end of the book, and they don't spend a whole lot on his death either. I know Alexander was sick for several days, and he really doesn't speculate on what it might have been. Some people think he was poisoned. This author says no, it was probably malaria or typhus or something like that. Second paragraph, page 496, and we're getting into some things that I just thought were interesting at the very end of the book. Caesar was the Roman Alexander, or at least the closest the Romans could boast. While 10 years to overrun Gaul was impressive, his campaigns could not truly match the sheer scale and fame of conquering Persia. Alexander was not simply the great to the Romans, but the greatest, at least when it came to military prowess. Livy, a Roman historian who wrote late in the 1st century BC, devoted a lot of space to the Second Punic War, when the Carthaginian Hannibal inflicted horrendous losses on the Romans, who only prevailed after a grueling struggle. Hannibal was beaten just once in the open field at Zama in North Africa in 2002 BC, a Roman victory that finally brought the end to the war. A few years later, an exiled Hannibal was at the court of a king of Asia Minor when he met Roman ambassadors, including Scipio Africanus, the man who had bested him in Zama. The encounter itself may actually have happened, and although the reports of what was said must be treated with as much caution as so many of the anecdotes about Philip or Alexander, Livy's version does seem to reflect a widespread Roman attitude. He claims that Scipio asked Hannibal to name the greatest generals of all time. Without hesitation, he placed Alexander first, followed by King Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the most famous leaders from the second generation of successor warlords, and then Hannibal himself. Asked what he would say if he had beaten the Romans at Zama, the Carthaginian declared that, in that case, he should be named first, an answer Livy declared to be typical of Punic artfulness, since it flattered both the speaker and his former enemy. And I've also read several books about Hannibal and the Punic, anything I could find on the Punic Wars. And I had never heard about this conversation with Hannibal and Scipio. Either that or I had and I forgot. That's totally possible. Third paragraph, page 508. And that's the second to the last page. Augustus cultivated a youthful image like Alexander, and may have been inspired in his mausoleum by the great tomb at Amphipolis. But he had the sense to admit that he was no military genius, preferring to rely on gifted subordinates. When he had defeated Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, and Mark Antony, a man who liked comparisons with Hercules and Dionysus, the great-nephew of Caesar went to the tomb of Alexander in Alexandria. After staring for some time, he reached out to touch the mummified corpse, and accidentally snapped off part of Alexander's nose. Asked whether he wished to see the tombs of the Ptolemies, he dismissively said that he had come to see a king, not corpses. And I've never run into that story before either. Or I have forgotten. Not only have I read about Augustus, Alexander, I've got entire books just about Alexandria and about the search for Alexander's tomb. I don't remember that story. Maybe I'm just losing it. Maybe I'm just getting old. Anyways, thanks for watching.